Now, the other matter we have on the agenda, of course, is Judge Gorsuch. I said weeks ago that I was approaching this nomination with an open mind. My vote on Supreme Court nominations have never been about reflexive partisanship. I have evaluated every nominee in the merits, and I have voted to confirm 6 Supreme Court nominees of Republican presidents. Unlike committee Republicans' unprecedented treatment of Chief Judge Merrick Garland, I take my constitutional duty to independently evaluate a president's Supreme Court nominee seriously. And of course, that includes Judge Gorsuch. For those of us who hope that Judge Gorsuch would use his confirmation hearings to give insight into the type of justice he would be, we were certainly disappointed. Based on his record, I had concerns about his views. I had concerns whether he'd bring a partisan agenda to the court. Judge Gorsuch did nothing to allay those fears. In fact, I could say he solidified them. I cannot recall a nominee, and I have voted on every member currently in the Supreme Court, plus many before. I cannot recall a nominee refusing to answer such basic questions about the principles underlying our Constitution and about how he interprets those principles. These are fundamental questions that we should ask every nominee seeking a lifetime appointment to our highest court. Some of the questions I asked them were not intended to be difficult. Several could have been answered by any first-year law student with ease. Yet, unless we were asking about fishing or basketball, Judge Gorsuch stonewalled and avoided any substantive response. He was actually excruciatingly evasive. His sworn testimony, his approach to complying with this committee's historic role in the confirmation process have been patronizing. That's a disservice to the American people. And it's a blight on the confirmation process. Judge Gorsuch claimed he did not want to prejudge potential cases. Well, that's a valid concern. We all accept that. But only within reason. It should not be used to evade questions on long-settled precedent or on the meaning and purpose of constitutional provisions. He wouldn't even state whether he agreed with certain landmark Supreme Court cases, such as Brown versus Board of Education. Is there anybody on this committee or elsewhere who would disagree with Brown versus Board of Education? He refused to say whether he believes the Equal Protection Clause applies to women. He refused to say whether the framers of the First Amendment believed it permitted the use of a religious litmus test. He refused to provide information regarding his selection by extreme special interest groups and a billionaire businessman. And he even refused to confirm whether he would continue to recuse himself from matters involving that billionaire, as he has done on the 10th Circuit, even if presented in the Supreme Court with the exact same facts. Now, I actually hoped that Judge Gorsuch would be more transparent and forthcoming in written questions after given time to carefully consider these questions away from the lights and the camera. But he again declined. He refused to expressly acknowledge that Congress has war powers, even though every high school student knows the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. He again misstated the holding of Citizens United in an attempt to evade my question about Congress's ability to enact campaign finance laws. Judge Gorsuch provided no answer at all to questions regarding the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. Refused to answer a question about women's rights to obtain contraception. He again refused to answer whether the First Amendment prohibits the president from imposing a religious litmus test, even when the Trump administration adamantly claims such a litmus test is not at issue with his travel ban. My family, I was brought up to believe in the First Amendment. It allows you to practice any religion you want or none if you want. And that we live in a country that does not impose religious tests. And so I think that Judge Gorsuch's non-responsive testimony makes it difficult for this committee to fulfill its constitutional duty to examine his judicial philosophy and evaluate his nomination. Now, perhaps we should not be surprised that the nominee would not respect the role of this committee after Senate Republicans let rank partisanship blind them from their constitutional duty to consider Chief Judge Merrick Garland. My distinguished colleague from Utah, Mr. Hatch, has read a letter into the record. Well, he believed in that, I guess, back then, but not now, because Judge Gorsuch was not even afforded, or Chief Judge Merrick Garland wasn't even afforded the courtesy of a hearing. Some members even refused to meet with him. What a shameful stain on the proud history of this committee. The lesson Judge Gorsuch may have learned from Senate Republicans' treatment of Merrick Garland is that this committee is nothing more than a partisan rubber stamp. Judge Gorsuch appears to believe that since Republicans are in the majority, he need not answer questions, and he's somehow entitled to confirmation. Unfortunately, the majority leader appears to believe that too, and his most recent statements amplifies that. You know, previous nominees, both Republicans and Democrats, respected this committee's constitutional role by answering questions in a substantive way, not with platitudes or aphorisms. One law professor wrote in The Atlantic that Judge Gorsuch was by turns condescending, evasive, and even dishonest. In fact, there's not much to say that he and his aw shucks gentlemanly way gaslighted the committee in a genteel but nonetheless Trumpian style. That description befits a nominee who the White House Chief of Staff stated has the vision of Donald Trump. Judge Gorsuch did not do nearly enough to prove Mr. Priebus wrong. In fact, he said that marriage equality is settled law, but refused to say the same thing about a woman's right to choose. That is telling, considering it's the same position taken by President Trump, who promised time and again to nominate justices who'd overturn Roe versus Wade. In fact, when he's pressed on this issue, Judge Gorsuch claimed his personal views did not matter. He refused to discuss them. In the article by Garrett Ebbs in The Atlantic put it, Judge Gorsuch implied the role of a judge is, quote, a job which calls apparently for neither values nor any firm connection to human life as it is lived. Chairman, I asked the article titled The Fundamental Dishonesty of the Gorsuch hearings be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Because actually the American people know better. Certainly the people I hear from in Vermont do. We know the court decisions, especially Supreme Court decisions, are not simply detached applications of neutral principles. If they were, well, then all judges would reach the same results for the same reasons. But they do not. Legal decisions are not mechanical. They are matters of interpretation, but they're also often matters of justice. One Supreme Court justice said more than a century ago, when we take our seats on the bench, we are not struck with blindness and forbidden to know as judges what we see. Now, whether you acknowledge it or not, Judge Gorsuch's record says a lot about his judgment and his sense of justice. And a policy wrote the Justice Department, as Senator Feinstein has noted, he embraced broad and discredited assertions of executive power. As a judge, he twisted statutory language to limit the rights of workers and women and children with disabilities. and he reached for broad constitutional questions that were not before him in order to advance his agenda. Judge Gorsuch complained about liberals relying on the courts to vindicate their constitutional rights. But he had no problem rubber stamping the far-right social agenda when he ruled that employers could control their employees' access to contraception. When the far-right groups that vetted him looked at that record, they liked what they see. The leader of that vetting has said that the process was driven not by, quote, who's a really smart lawyer who's been really accomplished, close quote, but by a search for someone, quote, who understands these things like we do, close quote. And we know that these groups, and the millionaires who fund them, have a clear agenda, one that's anti-choice, anti-environment, pro-corporate. These groups are confident that Judge Gorsuch shares their agenda. Well, that should concern all of us. I've thought a lot about this nominee. I've thought about whether I could find a way to support him. When I reached the decision to support Chief Justice Roberts' nomination, I did so knowing that he was conservative and knowing that my own party leader was going to oppose him. But I also believe that his record as a judge at the time showed a commitment to restraint and minimalism. Many other Democratic senators voted the other way, and I respect that. But Chief Justice Roberts' record allowed me to take him at his word that he did not have an ideological agenda. I said then that a vote to confirm requires faith that the words he spoke to us had meaning, close quote. But compared to Chief Justice Roberts, there's a yawning crevasse between the words of Judge Gorsuch spoke to us and his actual record. When viewed in isolation, perhaps his words would appear satisfactory. But when viewed in the context of his troubling tenure at the Justice Department, his unprecedented selection process by far-right interest groups, and his judicial record evidencing a partisan agenda, then they're unconvincing. These are extraordinary times. This is an extraordinary nomination. Last year, this committee forever tarnished its reputation. In 100 years of bipartisan tradition, to do the majority leader in Donald Trump's partisan bidding. Senate Republicans held a Supreme Court vacancy and an eminently qualified nominee hostage with the sole and express intent to deny President Obama an appointment to the Supreme Court, an appointment that he had every right by precedent, by law, to make. Now, since taking office, President Trump has focused his attention on targeting the very communities that are most at risk by his choice for the Supreme Court, a nominee who the White House tells us shares his agenda. This nominee has since refused to address any substantive issues during his testimony. He's left this committee and the American people with only unresolved concerns. The majority leader is now promising to rush this nominee toward confirmation, even to depriving senators of a full debate on the Senate floor. The majority leader has promised to use whatever tactic is necessary to get his way, to make sure that Donald Trump's nominee is confirmed, even if that means forever damaging the United States Senate. Now, I respect this institution as much as anyone. I never expected to be here long enough to become the dean of the Senate, but I have. And for those 42 years, I've devoted myself to the good the Senate can accomplish. But I cannot vote solely to protect an institution when the rights of hardworking Americans are at risk. Because I fear that the Senate I would be defending no longer exists. I've often said that the Senate, at its best, can be and should be the conscience of the nation. But I must first and foremost vote my conscience, both today and later this week. My conscience will not allow me to ratify the majority leader's actions. Not last year, not this year. I will not, I cannot support advancing this nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.